Hey everybody, and welcome to Chapter 9. We're talking about the chapter in our book called Psychology as the Science of Behavior. How fancy, and this is the layout that PowerPoint chose for me. I think it's because it saw the word science that I was writing and it suggested this, and I thought it looked kind of cool. What do you think? So this is a little bit different than how we normally meet. Obviously, I am recording from home because I'm not going to be able to be in class, but I'm going to try to keep this 45 minutes or less. We have 35 slides to go over. Some of them are going to whiz by though, so I think we can make it at 45. So normally, if I was writing the textbook, I think that probably my instinct would be to name this chapter Behaviorism, because that's a lot of what we're going to be looking at today. However, I like that they call it psychology as the science of behavior, because if you think about where we've come from so far, we've dealt a lot with philosophy, we've dealt a lot with physiology, and we've dealt a lot with medicine. Like we talked about Freud, who trained as a physician. We talked about Broca, and even Brenda Milner was a neuroscientist who kind of transitioned into psychology. So even when we talked about American psychology, you know, William James and Titchener, I think people are still hesitant to refer to that exactly as science, because it didn't exactly have testable hypotheses the way that we think about the scientific method today, even though they were certainly trying to push it in that direction. And remember, William James, he got out of the game because he did not think that psychology, he didn't think he was good enough, basically, or competent enough to really talk about psychology as a science. He thought it was just too complicated, so he kind of left the field, which is really humbling. All right, so let's get into it. What we're going to be talking about today are basically exactly what you would expect if you've taken Dr. Reyes or Dr. Andrade's learning class. If you've taken that class before, some of these names are definitely going to be familiar to you. So we're going to be talking about Pavlov, we're going to be talking about John Watson, we're going to be talking about B.F. Skinner, and then we'll kind of talk about some of the other people that came a little bit after him, such as Clark Hull, Ed Tolman, who's maybe my personal favorite of this bunch. Actually, no, I love Skinner. And then we'll talk about Albert Bandura. So let's start with Pavlov. This is going to be a little bit of an unusual place to start, because Pavlov is not exactly a psychologist. Pavlov was actually a physiologist, which again, that tracks with what we've talked about so far this semester. We've heard from a lot of physiologists so far. He was not interested in behavior initially. He was actually interested in digestion. And so what he would do, and as you probably all know, he had some dogs in his Russian laboratory. And actually, I can show you a picture of one. So this cute little girl right here. So she's got this affixated to her cheek. What is that? Basically, because Pavlov was interested in studying digestion, he had these vials affixated to the inner lip right there, so that whenever these dogs would eat, he would measure how much they salivated. And he would basically, he was really interested in kind of like pre-digestion, so how saliva breaks down meat before it gets to the stomach, because, like chewing and salivating are the first parts of digestion. So that's what he was interested in. And so this is one of Pavlov's dogs in color, which is pretty cool. So he mistakenly, probably by the story you've all heard before, he established a lot of the tenets of classical conditioning totally by accident. It wasn't even his field. And then he just kind of ran with it. Basically, he was so intrigued by what happened that he kept doing it and then started systematically studying what we now think of as classical conditioning. He didn't call it classical conditioning or anything like that. That was just kind of a name that we affixed to it around the time that B.F. Skinner created operant conditioning, so that we could talk about the new conditioning, operant conditioning, and the old conditioning, classical conditioning. But now we kind of see those two things as complementary. We don't see them as in opposition of one another. All right, so let's talk about these dogs for a second. So, like I said, you've probably heard this story before. You've probably seen an image just like this in one of your textbooks. I actually pulled this image from an intro textbook that I use, and I don't like it, and here's the reason why. Because we're in a history class, I get to be detail-oriented, and I get to tell you the truth, man. I get to tell you like it is. And this is not how it was. In fact, and so again, I don't know how much y'all know about this. Pavlov didn't use a bell initially whenever he was training these dogs to salivate. He was using a metronome. And if you're not familiar with metronome, you must not be a band geek like me. But a metronome is like one of those devices. They stand upright and they kind of click back and forth like. basically they count time, they keep rhythm, and it's a way of marking time. And so, as the story goes, Pavlov, he was interested in studying digestion, so these dogs would get into the room, and they'd hear this metronome, they'd have food poured out for them, already waiting for them by the time they came into the room. So they hear this sound, they eat, and then they leave. So, while they're doing that, obviously while they're eating, they are also salivating, because salivating is an unconditioned response. In other words, it's an automatic behavior that these dogs have whenever they put food in their mouth. And that's true for pretty much anything that we put in our mouth that might be edible. If you put anything in your mouth is going to start to salivate to try to break it down. It's an automatic kind of response that we have. But what he found is that one day he came into the laboratory, he started the metronome, he brought the dogs in, and then he realized he didn't have the food prepared, but the metronome is going. So by the time he got the food, which was actually powder, it was actually a meat powder, not actually food. The reason why it was meat powder is so that way he could give them food without actually having to worry about them chewing, without them having, it was easier to control by making it powder. So you can think of like basically the little packets of ramen, that the little beef powder you pour into your broth, that kind of thing. And so that wasn't prepared for them, but they heard the metronome and they started salivating, and that got him wondering, wait, why are these dogs salivating just at the sound of a metronome? And obviously it all comes together over a course of a number of years, where now we think of that as classical conditioning, that the food is paired with that instinctual response to salivate. Then it gets paired with an unrelated stimulus that we're going to call the neutral stimulus, and you pair the unconditioned stimulus and neutral stimulus enough, and what happens is that just the sound of the neutral stimulus is going to elicit a response. By that time, we no longer call it the neutral stimulus, we now call it the conditioned stimulus, and we call the salivation from hearing the bell or the metronome the conditioned response. Alright, so that's a quick crash course. You probably already learned about that stuff, but just nice to have a refresher because we're going to be talking about these ideas a lot. Around this time, Pavlov was also studying what we now know as generalization and differentiation. If you're not familiar with those, don't fret. You're not going to be tested on applying those or anything like that. But the idea that whenever we hear something that sounds close enough to a metronome, it makes us salivate. So, for example, if Pavlov was just clapping or snapping in rhythm, perhaps if the dogs generalized to that stimulus, they would start salivating. In other words, the stimulus was close enough to the original unconditioned response, the original neutral stimulus, which became the conditioned stimulus, is close enough to that they will start to salivate. Differentiation is basically the opposite, where if the dogs, whenever they heard the snapping, they're like, yeah, you can't fool me, I know that's not the metronome, so I'm not going to prepare to eat yet, I'm not going to salivate. That would be an example of differentiation. They're able to tell the difference between the metronome sound and the snapping or the clapping or whatever that other stimulus is. So Pavlov is discovering all of this stuff in his laboratory out in Siberia. These are all now kind of like seen as like the cornerstones of behavior. And y'all know me, I'm a cognitive psychologist, but my training in undergraduate and in my college, my advisor was a hardcore behaviorist, and so I have a lot of sympathy and a lot of interest and experience kind of thinking about learning and classical conditioning, stuff like that, even though as a cognitive psychologist it's kind of the enemy territory or whatever. But I've taught a learning class before. And so I'm perfectly happy to say that really like what Pavlov is discovering in his laboratory with these dogs are what we now think of as essentially kind of like the building blocks of behavior. It is kind of like the neutron and the proton and the electron of behavior. This is kind of where it all starts, is being able to create these associations, being able to generalize to other stimuli, but also discriminate within a single stimulus class. Some other things that he found, I'm not going to go into too much about this because it turned out to not be a big deal, but one of the things I say that, but if you're a dog, you may not feel this way. But Pavlov discovered something that he referred to as experimental neurosis. And experimental neurosis is essentially like these dogs, whenever they were given a completely random stimulus, that these dogs, whenever they were, hearing or experiencing this ambiguous stimuli, would sometimes be prone to stress. They would have stress responses instead of hunger responses, which is what he was aiming for. And the reason why that was interesting is because we start seeing something that looks, it's not the same, but that this stress response looks a little bit like what you see in humans whenever humans are also stressed out by ambiguous demands. And so Pavlov and others refer to this as experimental neurosis. The reason why that's important is because then people were like, okay, wait a second. In order to have these kind of behavioral complications, you don't need to speak to the unconscious. You don't need to speak to these Freudian mechanisms. Because basically Pavlov is doing this around the same time that Freud is getting popular in Europe. Psychoanalysis, for whatever reason, didn't really catch on in Russia the same way that it did in the States. So basically this is starting to get people thinking about, like, okay, well, you know, if we're talking about behavior, we don't necessarily have to refer to these Freudian defense mechanisms or the unconscious, because we don't think that these dogs have these kind of Freudian mechanisms. They don't have the same kind of unconscious that we do. And mind you, this is at the time, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, that people still thought of dogs and non-humans as automatons, as essentially robots, as essentially programmed beings that have no kind of free will and no kind of voluntary responses. And people still will argue that. That's totally fine. It doesn't matter what you believe. If you believe that your dog has a soul or a spirit or whatever, at the time people didn't think that they did have any kind of consciousness. And so seeing this in the laboratory was like, okay, we don't need these really highfalutin explanations to explain behavior. So that's enough about Russia. Let's talk about what's going on with America, because even though this history of psychology class is supposed to be kind of international, I feel like a lot of our textbook and a lot of what I know about the history of psychology is very American-centric. So while that's going on, there are going to be three people who really kind of changed the course of American psychology as a direct response to what Pavlov is doing. And the first is John Watson. Our classic reading is going to be about John Watson, the 1913 article, Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It. So he was absolutely 100% influenced by Pavlov. Made no apologies about it. It's very clear that he knew what was going on in Russia and was like, hey, I want to do this in the States. I want to start doing this kind of research, not necessarily with dogs, but with humans and with toddlers. That's how we get Baby Albert in a little bit. So he was basically, John Watson, which we're going to go into more detail in just a moment, he was basically very interested in focusing on behavior as if it is a science. Now, a little bit after John Watson's time came Clark Hull. So Clark Hull is usually referred to, sometimes people refer to him as like a second wave behaviorist because he was a little bit after John Watson's time. He pioneered what we now think of as neo-behaviorism or mechanistic behaviorism, because he was really adamant that we can use math and we can use statistics as a way to further develop psychology into a science, which is something that we still do today, right? Part of your major is that you have to take statistics for psychologists. So you can thank Clark Hull here, who's looking great, by the way, with this visor. He's got, like one of those old-timey visors, and just letting the top of his head kind of hang out in the breeze. It's a very cool look. So first, we got John Watson arguing we need to turn psychology into a hard science like biology and chemistry, which, by the way, is something that, even though Freud did not think that you could apply the scientific method necessarily to psychology, he did think that you should, if you're a psychoanalyst, you should have the same kind of training that a scientist would in order to do that. So he's not in total disagreement with Freud, although he does not have a very high opinion of Freud. He doesn't have a high opinion of many people, actually. But yeah, so that's kind of his perspective. Let's turn it into a science. Clark Hull is like, okay, it's a science. I'm not going to debate that. So let's start using the same math and the same statistics that biology and chemistry does to try to create models, to try to predict behavior in a quantitative way. And then next we have B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner becomes the face of psychology for several years. You can see him here on the cover of Time magazine, which honestly, I don't know how y'all feel about this, but to me it's like so weird to think that Time magazine would have like a psychologist on it, and everybody's supposed to know who the psychologist is. Like, that's just not something that you see today with the scientists. You might get lucky, where you have somebody like Stephen Hawking or Neil deGrasse Tyson, a physicist, gracing the cover of Time magazine, but I cannot tell you the last time I've seen a psychologist on the cover of Time magazine, and I would be hard-pressed to say who that person even would be. Maybe Zimbardo in the 70s? I hope not, but it might be something like that. So these three guys, very important for tracing the arc of where psychology is going. So let's talk a little bit about John Watson now. We're going to talk a lot about Watson later because we have a classic article dedicated to him. So I'm going to give you some background about his beliefs, but I'm going to let the article speak a little bit for itself. I want you to discover it on your own and not necessarily just listen to me lecture at you or at my webcam about it. He's seen as the he's seen as the founder of behaviorism, and he asserted that psychology really needs to be a hard science, like I mentioned. It needs to be in the science department alongside chemistry and biology and things like that, which means that we need to focus on observable behaviors, that we can't really rely on things like consciousness because as an explanation, because we can't directly observe consciousness. And so he felt like it was inappropriate for a science to really kind of delve into these things that are, I was going to use the word imaginary, but I feel like that there's a negative connotation with that. I don't think he would mind that. I don't think John Watson would mind that negative connotation, but I feel like it's a little bit unfair. It's a little bit reductive. But I think that that John Watson was not all that concerned with consciousness. He didn't think that you needed to invoke consciousness in order to explain behaviors. And he would demonstrate using the little Albert experiment, essentially that the same things that Pavlov was doing in Russia you can do with babies. That this isn't specific to non-humans, this isn't specific to dogs, that these same elements you can have in human beings too. And he did this with Rosalie Rayner, who we'll talk about a little bit later. She was his graduate student at the time and then became his wife shortly after that. Now here's the issue with this, and this is one of those things where, like, how our telling of history, that historiography, changes with the times. I remember whenever I was learning about this stuff in college, it was kind of like Rosalie Rayner was seen a little bit like as a joke, that she was like, this person who was his graduate student, then became his mistress, then became his wife, and, did the baby Albert stuff. I think today, in the 2020s, now when we see this, there's like some red flags that go off, right? That this was his graduate student, and so it's hard to not think about things like grooming, where, that he is this very powerful, influential figure, and she is subordinate to him as his trainee, and the really kind of messy ethics here. But I'm not going to belabor that point too much, and lecture somebody who's been long dead about the ethics of this and the power imbalance, but just to say that, like, our understanding of these people has changed a lot, even since I learned about this stuff in college, which was not 20 years ago, only like 10 years ago, actually. Whenever it became public that he was having an affair with Rosalie Rayner, his wife found out. He came home, all of his stuff was out in the front yard, just like you see in the movies, and news reached his boss at the university, so he got fired. He had to leave academia, and then he became an advertiser. He just like in Mad Men, which was around this time, in the 50s. He just jumped into advertising, and there's a lot of people who claim that he is responsible for a lot of the subliminal advertisements that you see sometimes, like the Camel Joe, how it looks like he has a penis for a nose, or you have like the FedEx logo, how it has like an arrow pointing in that logo, but it looks like an E and an X, but it's actually an arrow pointing, and the idea is that these kinds of things you're not supposed to be aware of, but that you're supposed to take note of and be influenced by them. That you might read that a lot online. There's not a lot of evidence for that, though. There's not a lot of evidence that he was helpful in creating subliminal advertisements, as cool as that might be as a story. But he really originated behaviorism as adversarial as he was. He was not a well-liked individual. He was somebody who was known as very abrasive and hard to work with because he was very strongly opinionated. And you can imagine if you're a psychologist and you're trying to talk about something like attention or consciousness or emotions, and he interrupts you and says, wait a second, those things don't exist. I dare you to prove to me that those things exist. Hold in your hands an emotion. Hold in your hands inspiration or attention. They don't exist. They are just concepts and constructs. He might not be that extreme in casual conversation, but he certainly writes that way, as we'll see later. So behaviorism is a school of psychology that really kind of tries to set aside anything that could be a subjective, that could be something that is open for interpretation, that we need to only focus on objective observations, things that you and a third party can measure and agree on. And if that sounds familiar, that is because that is empiricism. That is the cornerstone of empiricism. So these ideas from John Locke and René Descartes, these ideas about observation and being able to measure things and to verify things using your senses, those ideas from the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s are coming back in style. And John Watson's a big advocate for that kind of, conceptualization of psychology. Whenever we think about, or at this time, it's important to kind of think about him as a response to psychodynamics and psychoanalysis, that he is, in a lot of ways, not just pushing back at Titchener and William James, because he is, but he's also pushing back on a lot of the European front of clinical psychology that's coming through, things like psychoanalysis and talking about unconscious behaviors. Watson was having none of that. So if we're thinking about how Freudians would explain this, thinking about a behavior, now this is obviously a very simplified example, but if you had your foot to the fire, you're going to move your foot away from the fire. So why is that? Basically, what Freud would argue is that, okay, you have the stimulus, and then depending on your subconscious desire for pain, this unconscious force, if you have, a strong death drive, maybe you don't move away from it. But if you have a relatively working survival mechanism, then you are going to move away from it. So we have the stimulus, we have some kind of unconscious kind of process going on, and then there's a response. What Watson does, and kind of the big thing, how he changed the game here, is that he's saying you don't need this intermediary part. What's important is the stimulus and the response. That we had a stimulus, that we had some heat from a fire, and then the response, that we moved away from it. We don't need to be more complicated than that. It can be as simple as that. Why does this happen? Because it is a response to a stimulus that we experienced. It looks like I actually have these backwards, and I apologize for that. That basically this over here is the behaviorist approach, and over here on the left is the Freudian approach. So behaviorists argued that this piece right here, this Freudian idea of the unconscious or the subconscious, is completely irrelevant, that you don't need it in order to explain behavior. So Watson was very provocative in his discussion of emotions, because he was really kind of like, yeah, I don't want to talk about emotions because I don't think that you need to talk about emotions in order to explain why people do things. So let's say that you come home, you realize that your roommate has not done the dishes, so you get really upset and you slam the door. Why did you slam the door? You might say because you were angry. You might say because you were mad. What John Watson would say is that you slammed the door because you saw a stimulus and you were conditioned to slam the door. Previous times, whenever you have seen dirty dishes, it made you more agitated, more prone to doing violent outbursts or things like that. Basically, he would try to link this up with the associations that's created from a sink full of dirty dishes or previous experiences with this roommate and that you're generalizing to now. So Watson believed that a lot of human emotional experiences just come from stimulus and response, that basically that we don't have to think about this like as a fire and moving away from a fire. We can think about this as like, an email that you get from a professor and your response to it is that you're angry, and And whenever you're angry, you delete the email immediately. And what John Watson is saying is like, okay, you got a stimulus, the email, and your response was that you deleted it. And why? Well, because you got that email. That's all you need. That's the reason why you did it, is because you got this email, and in previous cases, you have learned that that is an aversive stimulus. And so you're going to avoid it, or you're going to get rid of it, or you're going to lash out at it. All right, so here are some of the examples here, because he thought all of this kind of emotional reaction, what we label as emotions, are all kind of physiological states that are just like what Pavlov shown in his Russian lab, that really emotions are no different than salivation. That, for example, fear is whenever you have is a response from having a sudden or unexpected loud sound or sudden loss of support. That is fear. So it's not, how scared you are. You'll notice that there is no word like scared or afraid. None of this internal kind of mechanism. It's just, this is the behavior. The same with rage. Rage, elicited when movement is constrained or restricted. Love, elicited by stroking the erogenous zones. Very, very cold and clinical, right? That it's really weird to think about love as being necessarily tied with the erogenous zones, but that is one way to objectively and operationally define these things. But you can probably, usually when I talk about this stuff with students, there's a little bit of pushback. A lot of students don't like thinking about behavior this way. They will argue that emotions are important. If we were in the classroom, I would try to take Watson's side here and argue that they aren't important. And so you can count on that whenever we get back in the classroom together. But I feel like this is in some ways kind of hard to argue with, that what he's saying here is very simple, that we have basically made behavior too complicated because we talk about behaviors and mechanisms that we can't see and directly observe, and that just makes it more complicated than it needs to be. Maybe it's just as simple as what's going on here. So here is another example of so this is the baby Albert study. So you can see Rosalie Rayner working with John Watson here. And this timeline here I think is really interesting. So the article that we're going to be reviewing, and this is really kind of like the Declaration of Independence of behaviorism. Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It. That was in 1913. That is a very clear dividing line in the turning point of psychology. And 7 years later, which is a long time, 7 whole years later, he did the baby Albert study to try to convince the public. They took video of it and everything to try to get people on their side. I'll give you a quick kind of description of it, but I will tell you more about this later in the semester. But the baby Albert study, basically they had this baby, his nickname was Albert, and they plucked him up from a hospital's daycare without his mother's permission. Yes, you heard me correct. And did some tests on him without his parents' permission. And what they did is they, long story short, they put a bunch of stimuli in front of him and gauged his reaction. One of the stimuli, as you can see here, is a white rat. Now, white rats, when our babies are in front of them, they don't know that white rats are scary or nasty or could carry the plague or may have fleas on them or whatever. Babies just want to touch it because it's moving and it looks interesting. And so, baby Albert wanted to touch that rat. He wanted to touch that white thing. And so they did this a couple of times. Then after a while, they put the white rat in front of him and they used a steel rod and a hammer, clanged them together, and watched what happened. Now, if you've ever made a really loud sound around a baby, you know exactly what happens. They freak out, they start crying, they start trying to get away from it. That's exactly what happened when he heard that noise. But what happened is that he also paired this irrelevant, unrelated stimulus, the white rat, with that really aversive stimulus. And the result of that was that now, whenever he saw that white rat, he would try to get away from it. Why? Well, because I think the way that we discuss this now is probably because classical conditioning took place, that an association formed. A really loud stimulus, which needs no conditioning, it automatically scares us and provokes a response in us, was paired with a rat. So now we associate the rat with that really loud sound. So now when we see that rat, we have the same kind of involuntary response of fear when we see that white rat. This generalized, because he also wanted to show how this could generalize to other stimuli. So like he gave the baby a bunny, a white bunny, and Baby Albert tried to get away from it. He showed him a Santa Claus mask, which had a bunch of white, fake hair on it, and that freaked the baby out because he generalized it was too much like the white rat, so it freaked him out. We'll talk more about Baby Albert in class later, but that's the gist of it. And they, like I said, they recorded all this using photos and using video film, video didn't really come around until the 70s and 60s, but you know what I mean, that they use film, they use celluloid to capture this, to try to make the argument to the American public that, look, that the same thing that what Pavlov is doing over in Russia with dogs, that's not unique to dogs, it's not unique to non-humans, that this happens in human beings as well, and I can show you, I have live footage of it happening, because seeing is believing. That's still true today. It was true back then. Then 10 years later, he issues a really incendiary quote that we're going to look at, and we'll talk about it more in class because I want to get your reactions on it. This image over here on the right, I will admit, I'm showing you this image just to kind of show you how the public perceived John Watson. Here he is studying the reflexes of a small infant by essentially seeing how long can they hold on to using their grasping reflex before the baby falls. It looks really scary, though, and I think it rubs people the wrong way whenever they see this. But that's the kind of research that he was doing. It was intentionally meant to be provocative. It was intentionally meant to make you feel a little bit mad, to make you feel a little bit uncomfortable with what you were seeing. That was the whole point. We see people do this all the time today. Log into any social media, and you'll find people make extreme claims or make really crazy opinions. Like people will say something like, as an example, they'll say like, "Oh, Quentin Tarantino's best movie is Jackie Brown," because it's a hot take. They're trying to get a reaction out of you. Clearly, Jackie Brown is a good movie, but it's not Tarantino's best. That's as an example. I don't know if that's too niche to talk about, but you get the idea that people will say these extreme things to get attention, right? Because it's provocative. John Watson, and I think today we call that shit posting, usually, right? John Watson was a shit poster of his day. So here's the incendiary quote that I was telling you. He gave this in an interview to a magazine, I believe, or maybe it was a newspaper, where they were asking him about behaviorism, and what he said was, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select, a doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggar, man, and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." So, what he's arguing for here, if that doesn't sound familiar, is exactly what John Locke was talking about when he was talking about the tabula rasa, the blank slate that we talked about in week number 2 of this class. This idea that we're all born totally blank, that we're born totally equal. So, yeah, on one hand, it is cool that, at a time in the 20s where the public was very prejudiced against different types of people. Normally I think today we think about this as being kind of like biases or prejudices against people of color, but this was in the 20s whenever it wasn't just people of color, but also the Irish and Italians and things like that, that people thought that the race of your ancestors had a tremendous impact on your temperament, your personality, your abilities, what kind of jobs you do, things like that. And he's coming along and he's again trying to be provocative, saying like none of that matters. It doesn't matter what what his talents are. It doesn't matter if he was born just really good at music. I can train him to be a good doctor. It doesn't matter if he was born bad at math. I can train him to be a good mathematician. So that he's making this claim. Give me a dozen infants and I can train them to become anything. And obviously, whenever he's making this is unverifiable. It's untestable because this is impossible. There's no way that somebody's going to give him a dozen infants and then let him basically play God with those infants. It was never going to happen. But he's making this claim in an interview. He's going to get a lot of attention. He's going to get a lot of press for this. And he's going to get a lot of people writing, talking about just how wrong he is. But what do we know about social media, right? And obviously this was not social media. He wasn't making a TikTok. He wasn't snapping this to somebody. But what do we know about the media? That people that whenever they make claims like this, that are seemingly unpopular, by giving them a platform, that these ideas spread and become influential. People start saying, no, you can't prove this. And then John Watson is like, well, then prove me wrong, you know? So he got a lot of people studying, or not studying, he got a lot of people talking about this and upset over it and writing about it. But at the end of the day, I think when people really started to think about it, they had a hard time kind of proving him wrong based on what he was saying here. Obviously, it's impossible to know if he was wrong or not because nobody's going to give him a dozen healthy infants and let him grow them for 18 years. But you get the idea. We'll talk more about that in class because it's kind of an interesting conversation starter. So let's talk a little about Rosalie Rayner. So you can see Rosalie Rayner right here. She actually died pretty young. She was only 36 whenever she passed away. But her claim to fame was that she was the one of the co-authors on some of John Watson's papers. So John Watson, again, very big advocate as psychology as this medium of science. Rewind a little bit. Remember the APA started up because of Stanley Hall. And so we're starting to have journals now. We're starting to have psychology journals. And Watson and Rayner are going to capitalize on this, and they're going to publish a lot of work together. They're going to publish a lot of work in these psychology journals about their findings. So she is a huge, and this is what kind of getting back to what I was saying earlier, she's a huge influence on psychology today, but was for a long time kind of reduced to this footnote of being the other woman for John Watson, which is completely unfair to her. Her interests were specifically kind of developmental psychology through a behavioral lens. And this is going to rub some people the wrong way because in 1930 she published this article called I Am the Mother of a Behaviorist's Son. Obviously the behaviorist is John Watson, but she's saying that I am the mother of a behaviorist's son, and basically was in this article was advocating for splitting off that familial contact as quickly as possible, that we shouldn't be relying on the bonds of motherhood to form an attachment with our children, that we should condition them in other ways. We shouldn't just be relying on, motherhood or fatherhood, however you want to define that. Obviously, Harry Harlow in the 50s and 60s with his attachment studies are going to change a lot of this stuff, but at the time, again, this was meant to be provocative. It was meant to make people uncomfortable. John Watson, later in his life, after he left academia, known not as a great father, as you might expect, his children talked quite a bit about him being very distant, very cold as a parental figure. You probably could have guessed that. He never gave them any hugs. He only gave them a handshake. If I recall, the only time that he hugged his children was at their mother's death. So whenever Rosalie Rayner died, he hugged their children, and that, I think, was the only time that they remembered him ever hugging them. So very cold kind of person, but stuck to his guns. He totally, even though this stuff was provocative and cold and clinical, he was, a man of his word. He was going to live like a behaviorist and practice what he preached. As I mentioned, he was kicked out of academia for that affair. There was some rumors that he had done some sex research, and that was the reason why he was kicked out of academia. But that proved to not be true. Thank God. So he's kicked out of academia. And even though he went into advertising, he still did write about behaviorism, but usually it was in the form of commentary and as reviews. He stopped doing his own research because he couldn't really at that point, but he would still write these commentary articles. There's actually the final article he ever wrote for a magazine was called Why I Don't Commit Suicide. Very, very bleak. Right, and this part of his life is not very well documented because he was starting to fall out of the public eye. But people suspected that maybe he was getting into alcohol or something like that around this time. But this article, the magazine rejected it. The editor was like, no, this is way too dark and morbid for this magazine. I don't want it published here. So it was just never published. And actually, I was going to say that have to double check. I may have a copy of this article. If I do, I will share it with the class, because it took me a long time to try to track down this article, and I think I still have it on my computer somewhere, but obviously it was not easily found because it was never published, but it's a kind of a really interesting read if you're interested in this kind of stuff. Alright, so let's talk about another one of Watson's trainees, and that is Mary Jones. So Mary Jones, looking happy. She looks delightful over here. She did not get kicked out of academia, but she is the first person to study systematic desensitization. If you're not familiar with what that is, it is one of the most tried and true clinical methods of counseling ever. And systematic desensitization is essentially where you take something that, well, there's a couple of different ways to do it. The way that she did it at the time is that she would have a fear-evoking stimulus. So let's say if you're afraid of spiders, you know, she's going to present spiders in front of you. And she's going to keep doing that until you're no longer afraid of it. She started out by doing this by pairing it with a pleasant stimulus. So I'm going to show you a spider, and I'm also going to give you some cake. And eventually, that the spider is going to be paired up with that pleasant stimulus enough so that it is no longer as fearful. Today, whenever people do this, it's usually done a little bit differently, where they take an aversive stimulus and they're going to present it, usually like if it's a spider, they're going to present it on the far side of the room from you. And they're going to let you calm down. They're going to let you kind of, you know, regain, you know, some kind of baseline, and they're going to bring it a little bit closer to you. And you're going to freak out, you're going to have a lot of fear, and then once that goes away, they'll bring it a little bit closer, with the idea being that you systematically are going to lose that fear response. It's used, like I said, used a lot still today when we treat phobias, when we treat trauma even. But that was the work of Mary Jones at that time. Yeah, so those are kind of some of the big figures of first wave behaviorism, of, you know, Rosalie Rayner, Mary Jones, and John Watson. So we don't have a ton of time left, but I want to tell you a little bit about some of the other flavors of behaviorism too, because it wasn't just John Watson's brand. There were other kinds of branches of it too. And the fun thing about this is that these branches are all kind of similar, but because they are different in that one little way, that all these guys would you know, argue with one another over really, really minute and niche details. So John Watson's kind of the classic flavor here. Clark Hull, I'm going to say he's the crunchy math flavor, because it's not super easy. He's using a lot of math to try to model out how quickly associations can be formed by, you know, using math, you know, to try to predict that stuff. We're going to have lean, sugarless, no frills behaviorism with B.F. Skinner. He was a very cut and dry, like, I'm not, you know, he wasn't really a provocative person the same way that John Watson was. So there's not like a lot of fancy frills. He didn't like torture a small baby or something like John Watson. We have the smooth cognitive flavor with Edward Tolman. So now you know why he's one of my favorites. It's because he's seen in some cases as the first cognitive psychologist, even though he wouldn't refer to himself as a cognitive psychologist. And then we have the social aspect with Albert Bandura. So let's talk a little about Clark Hull. So Clark Hull was known for mechanistic behaviorism, which is basically just behaviorism plus mathematics. So he disagreed with John Watson about the unknowability of internal events. So if we think about Clark Hull, or if we think about other behaviorists, they felt like things that happen in the mind or emotionally, that we can't directly observe them, so we shouldn't study them. Clark Hull is saying, wait a second, I actually don't believe that, and I don't know if you'd recognize him without that awesome visor that you saw him a couple of slides back. But he was saying, like, actually, it's okay if we try to figure out what's in that black box, because chemists and physicists do this all the time, right? We hear physicists today talk about black holes and string theory and other things that can't be directly observed with the human eye. And so he's saying, like, look, we can use the same kind of methods of inference that other fields do. We just have to be careful about how we make these definitions and how we quantify things. So that's kind of his perspective. Okay, sorry, I had to pause there for a second and do something off camera. So I'm just going to wrap this up because I know we're pressed for time. But one thing that really kind of differentiated Hall from people like Skinner and Watson was that he was really interested in motivational drive. So he was interested in probing this black box problem, which if you've taken cognitive psychology, you know, we talk about the black box problem. I think we even talked about that a little bit in this class. But he believed that by using inference and observation that you can be able to make some conclusions about things like motivation. So, in other words, he would think Clark Hall advocated for things like the thirst drive, sleep drive, sex drive, and things like that. He basically would argue that some of these drives need to be satiated. So, we get thirsty and then to a point, and then once we reach a certain threshold, we'll act on it. Which is, it was groundbreaking at the time and still something that we kind of talk about today, but we don't really think about them like motivational drives these days, but it is, his whole legacy of like using computation and mathematics to forecast behavior is absolutely something that's still done today. All right, the last person that I want to talk a little bit about is the radical behaviorists, and this is where we generally are going to see people like B.F. Skinner. Now, the reason why it's called radical is because the idea is that old school first wave behaviorism, behaviorism from the 1913s up to the 1930s and 40s, was kind of seen as like stimulus response learning, very classical conditioning, in terms of its applications. And then whenever B.F. Skinner came around, he essentially was like, wait a second, no, it's okay for us to study internal events. It's okay for us to talk about the mind, and it's okay for us to talk about emotions, but we need to be careful and just make sure that we talk about those things using behavioral application for all of this stuff. Which means that if we're talking about things like emotions, that emotion is just a covert behavior, that we can treat it like a behavior that we can't see. So using this idea, then you can learn to associate emotions. You can learn to associate different thoughts and perceptions with other items. Just because you can't see a perception or see a thought or an emotion doesn't mean that they're not there, because we know that they are subject to reinforcement and punishment and schedules of reinforcement and classical conditioning. So basically it's radical because we're now applying these behavioral principles of associative learning, generalization, discrimination, and soon we're going to get operant conditioning, that we can apply those to all facets of our human experience, which brings us to our good boy, B.F. Skinner, our good friend, Burris, my advisor. I would always call him Burris because he loves Skinner so much. We'll talk about Skinner quite a bit. Most people think of him as the guy with the Skinner box and the rats and the pigeons and stuff like that, and the lab coat. But fascinating figure, one of the most influential figures in all of psychology, especially in the 20th century. So we'll talk about him, and we're going to be watching Project NEM, which is a documentary that kind of circles around one of his, actually it was his very last student. Herb Terrace was his last student, and we'll kind of follow that trail from there. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you later. Bye.